Well, welcome back, and I hope you've had a good coffee break. We're a select band here in person, a very special group of people, but you'll be pleased to know there are probably about 3 or 4 times the number online joining us, and that's the beauty of the hybrid system. This session, we've called it the President's Symposium because, as some of you may know, for a long time I've been involved with, as an editor, both of journals and books. And I think back to the words of George Bernard Shaw, who said, "Those that can do and those that can't teach." To which my father, who was an English teacher, in indignation said, "And those that can do neither, write." But I feel that can't be what we ask of surgeons, because we do and we teach, but it is so important that we write. We write to express ourselves, to exchange knowledge, and it is truly extraordinary when you look back maybe a century or even more before, how much of the science and learning was exchanged through writing. There was no other means of communication other than, I suppose, doing the circuit around Europe, as many people did, or North America. The problem about writing is that you have to publish it, and that's where we get publish or perish. And so many people write and it's not published, and it is an awful waste of time. And one thinks of the number of randomized controlled trials that are initiated, and it becomes clear that there is no difference, or it's a negative trial and it never sees the light of day. We're very fortunate this morning to have 3 different editors, and I'll speak about Melina in a moment or two, but from on high, because Melina Kibbe is Editor-in-Chief of Jama Surgery, which has suddenly soared to great heights and is now the highest impact factor journal in our specialty. Derek Alderson, who is a long-time friend, and we served in the BJS trenches together, and he was Editor-in-Chief. And then we had this experiment which was opening a new journal, open access journal, BJS Open, and you have led it so well through its infant years, and now it's toddling along on its own feet with a really impressive impact factor of 3.46, I think, which for an open new journal, open access, is extraordinary. And then, of course, our own David Healy, who is editor of The Surgeon, which is a publication jointly shared between ourselves and the Edinburgh College, which of itself is interesting because it has an international authorship that comes. It has a very impressive impact factor for a journal that is actually not, it's a very general journal, but it is still a low impact journal overall. And so we have 3 different aspects. Sadly, Des Winter, my colleague, who is Editor-in-Chief now of BJS, was to be the discussant. But Des flies so high usually, he usually escapes COVID, but it caught up with him this week. And sadly, he can't join us, and he's feeling a bit wretched this morning, so he won't be the discussant. I've known Melina for a couple of years, and I really have been astonished at what she has achieved and her ability. She's Dean of the University of Virginia School of Medicine. Prior to that, she was Chair of the Department of Surgery of the University of North Carolina and a distinguished professor. She has an impressive research portfolio. And those of you who are online on the vascular session yesterday morning, I really knew so little about what fluoroquinolones can do to you, but I can assure you I will never have Cipro again because I don't want to develop an aneurysm. So, Melina, you're very welcome to Dublin and to Ireland, because I know you've had the opportunity to see a little of the West Coast. And we're really looking forward to the view from on high from Melina Kibbe. You're very welcome.
Thank you so much, Professor O'Connell. This has been an absolutely wonderful invitation, and both Dr. Patty and myself have really enjoyed seeing your beautiful country over the several days before this meeting. Unbelievable. So this session is exciting, as you said, a session of different editors, and you gave me this title. So I've maybe tweaked what I'm going to talk about in the next 20, 25 minutes or so. And just so you know, I don't have any disclosures, any relevant financial disclosures, except, of course, I am speaking from the perspective of being editor-in-chief of Jama Surgery. And I have served on many other editorial boards and still serve. They haven't kicked me off yet. JACS, ACSK Series, and JBS Science. Now, I thought I would just start with a little bit so you could understand the perspective that I am speaking from. So I assumed the role as editor-in-chief of JAMA Surgery January 1st of 2015. It's even hard for me to believe it's been over 7 years now. Time flies. And so this session that you put together is interesting because I actually feel I can speak from the perspective of a lower impact factor journal and then the journey through becoming a higher impact factor journal, because when I took over, it was 4.3. And yes, I can tell you, things change with the journal when your impact factor changes. And I have learned so much over the last 7 years about publishing. I would also say I'm a vascular surgeon, but this role has really kept me grounded in all of the disciplines of surgery, and I've really appreciated that. And I will say that that went hand in hand with being a chair of surgery because my residents hated it because I would actually know the literature in all these other areas, so it was great. But the thing that's been most interesting, and one day maybe I'll make a talk on this, is human behavior. So I have witnessed unbelievable things as the impact factors change from 4.3 to 14.8. And I'm telling you, I could give a whole hour-long talk about human behavior when it comes to author behavior, peer review behavior, etc. It's fascinating. Now, the statistics on JAMA Surgery, so it is an international journal, important for all of you to know that. So half of the submissions are from outside of the United States. And actually, I have a very tight board. So there's 15 board members from the United States and 15 that are outside of the United States. So I can only ask someone else to come onto my board when somebody departs. So it's a very tightly regulated board, which is unlike most of our surgical journals. Our submissions, they skyrocketed through COVID, like I'm sure pretty much every journal experienced, and now it's coming back to its baseline, although we're still a little bit above our baseline. And we are a small journal. This is the other thing you need to know. We publish only about 9 to 10 original investigations a month. And so because of this, you see what the acceptance rate is rather low. Although I will say this is a very similar acceptance rate to Annals of Surgery, which is right behind us. But I do want you to know the acceptance rate for research letters and viewpoints are higher, so for those of you who are considering to submit. Our impact and our reach impresses me every day, and I will say that this is one of the main reasons why I would encourage folks to try to publish in our journal, because if you publish in JAMA Surgery, we can really make sure that your work is seen. And so the power of being part of the JAMA network is what this journal really benefits from. So our altmetric score, last year we published 4 of the top 5 altmetric articles, 32 of the top 50. We've had more than 3.6 million articles viewed from our website. Our electronic table of contents goes to almost 95,000 people every time that is delivered. We have a pretty strong social media presence, so we're clearly reaching over 100,000 individuals. That's the power of a journal like this, to get your work seen and to get it picked up in the media so even the lay audience sees it. Now, what I'm going to cover, again, from that perspective that I just showed you, is I am going to briefly talk on each one of these different topics in the publish or perish era, as you gave me to talk about. But again, this is going to be brief. I have a much longer versions of several different aspects of this topic. So understanding the peer review process, I find that this is something that is critical, and not everyone understands this process. So if you start in the top left box when you're submitting your manuscript as an author. So basically the process for most journals is that it then, you usually have some kind of a managing editor that's going to determine if the basic formatting requirements are met. If they're not, that may be a reject right there sent back to the author. If they're met, then it typically will go to some kind of an associate editor, a deputy editor, however that particular journal is set up. And if they do decide to send it out for peer review, then the reviewers are signed. So then it goes to the peer reviewers, who simply provide the recommendations that then go back to possibly the associate editors, who then provide a recommendation to the editor, who makes a decision. And so you could have accept, although it's incredibly uncommon, at least with JAMA surgery, to have an accept with the first submission. More likely it'll be a revise or a reject. And if you revise, when you resubmit it, it goes through the same process. And that's important to remember, because I'll give a comment later about reviewers if you're submitting a revision. Now, in selecting the right journal, I think this is really important. So currently, right now, with the journal citation reports, the number of journals in surgery continues to grow significantly. We're up to 272. Every year this comes out, it's like it expands. I fully expect this to be over 300 the next time our numbers come out in June. And then you can see the impact factor of the surgery journals. And so it has been an interesting ride, as I mentioned to you, as our journal has gone up from the 4.3 to where it is right now. Very interesting ride. Now, selecting the right journal, this is really important, because I do think if you're going to submit work, it helps to pull up that list of impact factors and look at the different journals that you're going to consider. If you have novel and innovative research, if you've got a randomized clinical trial, then you should, by all means, try for a high impact factor journal. Now, if you're doing confirmatory work that has already been shown in one discipline, but you're now showing it, say, in another discipline, that may get into a lower impact factor journal. And I will definitely say that the era of single institution retrospective studies, it is getting to be a challenge for anyone to get those published, because there's just so much outcomes and health services research being done now. So those are getting harder. And then one thing I'll say that is super easy to do is you definitely want to make sure that you're submitting to a journal that takes your kind of work. And a great example is for JAMA surgery. It just takes looking at one table of content, and you will realize we don't publish basic science research. So don't submit your basic science research to a journal that only publishes clinical work. This is where I mean, do your homework, just take a look at a couple table of contents, and you will see if that journal is appropriate for your work or not. Now, preparing to write, I do like what you mentioned about writing. So I tend to think of writing as 3 different phases. And I'm sure many of us in this room write with a lot of other folks, a lot of trainees, etc. So there's the preparing to write, then there's the active writing, and then, oh my gosh, I think the most important part is the revising before you submit your work. So I'll just say a few things on each of these. So the preparing to write, I at least try to drill into all of the folks that are writing with me is they must pull the instructions for authors for that particular journal. Because there's no quicker way to annoy a managing editor, an editor, or the peer reviewers, or the editorial board members than to not follow that journal's instructions for authors, because they have taken time to publish those instructions for authors. So it's simple. Make sure you pull up those instructions for authors and follow the format that is recommended. Now, in writing a manuscript, we're all super familiar with the standard format of the introduction, the methods, the results, and a discussion section. So I'm going to just give you about a slide on each one of these. Again, I have a much longer talk that goes into more detail, but I think that I've written with so many trainees that over the years, I've adopted this process to try to make the writing more fun. And what I find causes the most delays in the trainees actually writing the papers is their fear of writing the discussion section, and then after that also the introduction, and just not knowing how to get over that roadblock. So I've distilled it down. So, and I am a firm believer of creating outlines of papers from the get-go that I go over with folks. The introduction, I am here to tell you that I believe every paper, an introduction can have 2 or 3 paragraphs. That is it. If you have an introduction that has more than 3 paragraphs, it is likely too long. And here's a structure, an example of one. Your first paragraph is where you state what the problem is. So if it's something, since I am a vascular surgeon, it could be atherosclerosis is bad, causes heart attacks, whatever. Paragraph 2 is, and as you're drilling into the problem, you could actually then be drilling into, okay, well, inflammation is one of the main etiologies of atherosclerosis, but what is not known is X, Y, and Z. And then that clearly leads into what you're going to study. So then you can state your aim and your hypothesis. If you do this in 2 paragraphs, you could combine paragraph 2 and 3 into 1. And so I think that is a very simple structure for an introduction. And then again, I try to remind my folks when we're writing that writing is always about telling a story. And if you're not telling a story, folks are not going to want to read your manuscript. And I think the introduction has to be a really good, gripping way that's going to get their interest into what you're talking about. I think the materials and methods is pretty straightforward. And so this is, again, telling the reader what you did to answer the questions you posed in the introduction. You want to make sure that you're describing your methods in enough detail so that other folks can reproduce your work. That is so important. Make sure that you're citing published methods. And if you're deviating from those published methods, that you state your deviations. So I did the rat carotid artery injury model published by Conti et al. However, we modified this aspect, something like that. If you have new methods, then you really need to describe those in detail, and you need to also describe what tests you did to validate that new methodology. Now, the results section, again, it's so important to tell a story. And it doesn't really matter how this is organized, as long as it makes sense for the work that you are presenting. It could be organized chronologically in how things were done. It could be organized most to least important, or the other way around. If it's basic science or translational work, in vitro to in vitro, in vivo, it's just the key is to tell a story. And so one thing I like to do with the folks that I write with is actually have them draw out what the figures of the whole paper are going to be at the very beginning before any writing. And we put all of the figure 1, figure 2, figure 3 out on a table. And I look to see, is it telling a story? Because if the figures don't tell a story, forget it. So the figures have to tell the story. And then the writing is really easy. So in the results section, important to state the results, of course, of the experiments. And you want to try to emphasize what those take-home messages of the results are. And then don't forget to point the reader to the figures or tables. This I see often with JAMA surgery, where people will just forget to say figure 1, figure 2. So make sure you don't forget that. And then another key that peer reviewers will pick up pretty much every time is if you have too much overlap between your text and then the figures in the tables. And so try to not have too much overlap when it comes to that. Now the discussion section, this is the section that I find really causes my trainees to put off writing the most because they're kind of lost and are not sure how to tackle this. So I will also tell you that you can write any manuscript, the discussion section, in 5 paragraphs. So what are those 5? And when you break it down like this, it becomes so simple when you do the outline. So the first paragraph is easy because this is the summary. So that's where you say, in summary, the data presented in this manuscript show blah, blah, blah. Easy. That one's an easy one to write. This is the area where most people struggle with. And this is where paragraphs 2 and 3, and if you're going to have more than 5 paragraphs, then this is where you could have extra ones. This is where you need to compare and contrast your data to published literature. I'm going to expand on this in one slide because that's the hardest part. Paragraph 4, super easy. It's your limitations paragraph. Now, for those of you thinking, I don't have any limitations, every single publication has limitations. So you do need to address your limitations. And trust me, if you don't, your peer reviewers will call you out on it. Now, I would say you also don't want to go overboard. I still recall to this day a manuscript where one of my postdocs wrote such a detailed limitations paragraph. I just asked her, I said, well, can we just reject it right now? Because you put everything there. Don't do that either. And then your last paragraph is also straightforward. This is where you conclude about what everything means and possibly what your next steps are. So if you outline your manuscript like this, it becomes so much easier to write the discussion section. And then I'm just going to expand one slide on that hard part, the comparing and contrasting. So this is where you do have to hit the literature, do your PubMed reviews, whatever you're using to search. You want to compare and contrast your data to what is already published. You want to explain if you have agreements or discrepancies, and oftentimes it's going to be the latter. Your data does not necessarily agree with what's been published. You want to explain why. An example for me on a basic science study was, and I remember this, I was working on neointim hyperplasia, and we showed the exact opposite of another study. And when I pulled the other paper and dug into it, they used a different strain of rats. And that could certainly have accounted for it. So I discussed that in the discussion section. You also want to explain unexpected findings. You want to describe patterns or principles or relationships that your work might show. Let's say if you're looking at one human population, you might want to compare it to another. Do your results have theoretical or practical implications? And do they have relation to other situations or species? And so you can see that these are all of the different things that you can do in that 2 to 3, or if you want to add 4 paragraphs. But then I would say you really don't want your discussion section to be more than 6 or 7 paragraphs. I literally, when I peer review, I'm counting up the number of paragraphs in the discussion section. Trust me, yes, I do that. So don't make your discussion section too long. Now, after you've written your paper, this is the part that I think is the most important, because how many in this audience, and I know we have a lot of senior folks in this audience, have had a trainee or someone you're writing with hand you the manuscript, but they have not yet proofed their own writing? We've all experienced that, right? So please, just like you proof your own emails, proof your own writing, because you need to go back. We all don't write perfectly the first time. So make sure you revise your own writing before you submit your manuscript. And I would say before you submit your manuscript to your mentor, make sure you proof your own writing, because there's no such thing as good writing. There is only good rewriting. And the ultimate goal of your manuscript is clarity of communication and telling that story. And you want your readers thinking about your actual science and not what on earth you were thinking about when you wrote the manuscript. You want to make this easy for your readers, so definitely have somebody else proof your work before you're submitting it. So important. Now, you've submitted the manuscript to the journal. What happens next? So it goes through that process that I showed you. You get it back. You get your response from the reviewers. So here's what I recommend. Take a deep breath, in and out, sit down, read the comments, and then put those comments away. Do not write anything. Do not, because there's a chance, high likelihood, that you may not be happy with some of the comments from the peer reviewers. So I think, yes, we can all agree. I love the laughter because we've all been here. Do not write immediately. Now, when you're responding to reviewer comments, this is an art form. And if you actually can follow these recommendations, trust me, you should get every manuscript accepted if you had a revise. So most journals require you to respond to every reviewer comment in a logical and numbered way. And I'll just show you an example in a minute. You want to literally copy and paste the reviewer's comment, and then under that, indicate your response and what changes you've made to the manuscript. That's both. Don't just indicate your response without indicating that you revised the manuscript. That's not good. That'll end up getting punted back to you likely, or it could be in a reject. Try to modify as much as you can. And I'm here to tell you, you can pretty much modify the manuscript for every single comment. Even if there's a comment you don't like, then you could add something to your limitations paragraph and saying a limitation of the study is we did not look at this. You literally can revise something for every comment. Do remember, your tone in your response is very, very important. And don't ever argue. My suggestion to you, don't argue with the peer reviewers. Because if you got a revise or the category of major revise, it's highly likely it's going back to that same person for re-review. So if somebody took the time to tell you that they would like to see X, Y, and Z done, but you just argue with them, do you think they're going to recommend accept? Probably not. So try to remember your tone and be super polite. So here's an example, and this is not meant to be read, but you can see that I have numbered, that's the numbered non-bold spot is where I basically copied the reviewer's comment, and then in bold is my response. This is for one of my own manuscripts. So you can see the general format. Now here's honing in. Okay, here's an example. So the reviewer wrote, in the abstract, the authors describe emerging therapies as alternatives to medical instrument, blah, blah, blah. So I wrote, thank you for pointing this out. We have revised the abstract. Polite, something was revised. Another example, figure 3D, in the text, the authors comment that the effects of nitric oxide and proteasome activity, blah, blah, blah. So I said, again, the reviewer is correct and perceptive to these small but distinct differences. The manuscript has been revised, blah, blah, blah. Notice I get it out really early that something has been revised. So very important. Now look at this. Some peer reviewer took the time to write that entire thing. So you know this peer reviewer was really invested in my response. So then I said, again, thank you for the careful review of this figure. You picked up an important aspect. And yes, I revised something. So this is just an example, and you can do this for in addition to basic science, definitely clinical work. Now, I thought that I wanted to cover at least the top 10 reasons why manuscripts are rejected with JAMA surgery. This is my JAMA surgery hat on. However, do remember my perspective is as the journal has evolved. So I do think most of this goes for all of our journals. So, and we do have a pretty high reject without review rate. So that means that the editor and the deputy editors are rejecting without sending it out. So I would say these are the top 10 reasons probably for rejecting without sending it out for peer review. So one, the topic is just not relevant or suitable for the journal. Again, take a look at the table of contents. If you're submitting basic science work to JAMA surgery, it's going to get rejected out of the gate. So just take a look. Number two, the study is just not novel or innovative or significant. So again, do your homework, look at the impact factor, know where if it's a prospective randomized clinical trial, please do consider JAMA surgery, versus a single institution retrospective review. And I will just tell you with JAMA surgery, there's also topics like, the whole opioid crisis. I'm still getting opioid papers like crazy. So we can only publish so many. Same goes with frailty. Same goes with COVID. How many more descriptive COVID studies studies do we need? And so, and the last one, my pet peeve, predictive models. Who here actually uses any of the published predictive models? Right? Exactly. And I get predictive model studies submitted to our journal on probably an every other week basis at least, if not weekly. Another reason for reject, if you don't follow the instructions for authors. Number 4, another reason is if there's just poor writing or poor organization. So again, this gets to making sure that you proof your work carefully. Study design. Now this is becoming very important as we've exploded when it comes to outcomes and health services research. So I think your study design is really important. So if you need to, make sure that you involve a biostatistician. Beware of having appropriate controls. Beware of confounders. If you're using a database, make sure that the database that you are using is appropriate for the question that you are exploring. And so we, this was in 2018, the editorial board of JAMA Surgery, we actually published a little 10-article series, like primers, on all the different surgical databases that are available. And each one is just like 2 pages. I think here's an example. And it shows what the database is good for, what it should not be used for, and some pearls. So I would refer you to that. Number 6, if your statistical analysis is not appropriate. Again, stats are getting very complex with health services research. Most journals nowadays are starting to employ biostatisticians to review the manuscripts. So be sure your statistical analysis is sound. And so another thing we did, our second series that we published, this was in March of 2020, is what we call the Methodology Toolbox. And we did a little 2-page primer on all of those methods that you see. So qualitative research, there's one on meta-analyses, one on mixed methods, etc. So I would refer you to this series if you're going to be doing health services research, and pull the paper is quite good. Number 7, if you did not have your regulatory approvals, this definitely would be a reason for this to be rejected. I'm super impressed at peer reviewers because they pick up on this every single time. And if you haven't registered your clinical trial with clinicaltrials.gov, that will be another reason why it will be rejected. I find that a lot of people are forgetting to register their clinical trials, so try not to do that. If you're not following reporting standards, so reporting standards are now, this is real. And so I would say go to Equator and make sure that you are following the reporting standard for the type of, this is again for outcomes and health services research. And you can see the different reporting standards from Consort to Strobe to Prism, etc. So we recently also, in our 3rd series to try to help folks who are doing outcomes and health services research, we just published this last April. And again, it's a little 2-page primer on all of the different reporting guidelines and how to use them. So I would refer you to this published series as well. Number 9, if there are ethical concerns, of course this would be a reason for something to get rejected. Most journals now are using software to check for plagiarism and self-plagiarism. Self-plagiarism we also can't have, and there's many more senior folks in this room who are writing over and over again and may want to use their own work, but we now have to be aware that if you publish with a traditional journal, they own the copyright of your work. So you also need to revise your own writing, so be very careful. So most journals, again, whether they're running every submission through or just submissions that have been accepted, journals vary with that, but be aware this is what a report looks like from Authenticate. And then 10, the final reason, if you did not adequately revise the manuscript, this would be another reason for reject. And it pains me whenever I have to do this, and I will almost always leave a personal note as the editor, but listen, you're given a shot, and if you don't adequately revise it, the editors, we don't have to publish your work. So the onus is on the author to really revise accordingly. So this is why I'm saying, please revise the manuscript as best as you can without arguing with the reviewer or the editor. Now I'm going to end with just some general advice from an editor. So, pet peeves. Please do not email an editor and ask the editor through email, outside of the editorial submission process, using their work email, if your journal is appropriate for the work. Do your own homework and just look at the table of contents. It amazes me how many times I get these emails and somebody's asking about some clinical study. I'm like, have you looked at a single issue of my journal? So don't email the editor to ask them if the work is appropriate. Just do your homework. Make sure you read the instructions for authors. I've probably said that now 5 times. Appeals. So appeals, I think, are rarely successful. In my 7 years, I can probably count on one hand now how many manuscripts I have resent out for review on appeal, because I do look at every single decision myself. I'm very thorough, I'm very careful, and so are my deputy editors. And so just know there are reasons, and sometimes the reasons have nothing to do with science. Again, I can only publish so many opioid papers, so things like that. This is human behavior, so don't argue with anyone, because again, the editors and the associate editors, we don't have to publish your work. And if somebody is starting to get nippy in emails and unpolite in emails, do you think that helps your case to get your manuscript published? This is where it amazes me, some of the emails I have received from individuals, human behavior. And don't argue or be rude to the managing editor, because the managing editor is just going to tell the editor. So again, be kind in all of your interactions. Don't submit to one journal and have a different journal's name on the cover letter. Classic. Make sure you disclose all of your conflicts of interest. This is important. Peer reviewers are sharp. And trust me, if you have not disclosed a conflict of interest, most likely the peer reviewers will pick it up and they will inform us. So don't do that, because that'll be a reject. Be transparent with your authorship decisions. It is not the journal's job to dispute authorship positions. So I would say make sure you are following the ICMJE authorship criteria. And then lastly, I will say that be aware that, for example, if you submitted something to Annals of Surgery, it was reviewed and rejected, and you submit it to JAMA Surgery, you may get the exact same peer reviewer. And that peer reviewer will go, I already reviewed this for Annals, and they didn't change a thing. Not going to help your cause. So just be aware that a lot of you review for a lot of different journals. So in summary, I have briefly covered these different topics for the publish or perish topic. Again, I do have longer versions of all of these, and I've actually published a little primer on how to write a manuscript, so you could pull that up under my name in PubMed, and it has everything that I said in this talk. I do want to end with kind of going back to what Dr. O'Connell was saying, is that writing is fun. It really gets to a point where it's fun, but you do want to be strategic, and you want to make sure that you're telling a good story. If you're not telling a good story, then there's something that's wrong. You want to make sure that you revise your own writing many times over before you submit this and have other people proof it. If you understand why manuscripts are rejected, then it's going to help you to avoid all those pitfalls that I just discussed. And then remember, your tone is important with every single interaction that you have with the journal. But in the end, good science is good science. So I want to thank you. This was a picture from our editorial board the year that we broke double-digit impact factor. I have to say that I never thought when I took over at JAMA Surgery that I thought it was a 10-year proposition to break double digit, because no surgery journal had ever done it. And the impact factor for JAMA Surgery is one thing, but what makes me more proud is that our discipline of surgery now has several journals that are double digit impact factor. And so that's important for our field, and that's what I love. Thank you so much for the honor to give this talk.
Well, my goodness, I think we're all energized by that wonderful talk, and so thank you so much. We'll have discussion at the end, but I was minded, I learned a lot from Dr. Keith Kelly that some of you may remember from the Mayo Clinic when I did my fellowship out there. And Keith always insisted that the last sentence of the introduction should be, the aim of this study was to determine. Because if you couldn't put it in one sentence, forget it. Because you didn't know, and nobody else would know. And the other thing was, in the days before we had word processors and emails, so you'd spend days and days and days with a golf ball typewriter putting this manuscript together. And you'd put it in Keith Kelly's pigeonhole, and the next morning you'd come in, and do you remember there were these yellow legal pads that they had in North America? Well, he would have taken a scissors and he would have cut out pieces and stuck them on this yellow legal pad and and then there weren't word processors. It was back to the golf ball. So writing in those days was a labor of love, and it still remains so. So thank you for that wonderful presentation. So from a view from on high, we're coming to the surgeon, and welcome David Healy.
Well, thank you very much. I really enjoyed the last presentation. It really summarised an awful lot of stuff for me in my role. I agree. This is supposed to be fun, and everyone involved is doing it for free. It's a voluntary scholarship goal entity. So some of the human nature stuff that you come across, you alluded to, Melina, in terms of the interaction with some of the authors and stuff, it is human nature, I guess. So that's always been an interesting bit for it. So I didn't choose the title for this. I was handed it. So I'm very sorry that I'm looking up from low down, looking up at Jama, looking from high up. I think the idea is really just to show you what your own journal does, and that's really what I'm going to hopefully tell you here and give you some information about what your journal is doing in the College of Surgeons. I do have to just say one thing. Unfortunately, with all the dates and stuff that changed with this, I have a prior commitment to my son's international rugby career, which involves me getting on a plane to Manchester for the high-flying under-11 competition tomorrow. So I'm actually going to have to leave here at 5:30, unfortunately. I'm happy to take questions afterwards, but I am on a gun to go. The title of this is Impact Factors. So what is impact factor and how relevant is it? So the surgeon, your journal, has an impact factor of 2.3. Just benchmarks, the full medical JAMA is 56. New England Journal of Medicine, obviously the highest one at 91. But just among surgery, our leader is 14. AMJ Surge 2.4. Our own European Journal of Cardiothoracics 3.3. BGS 6.9. And the Annals of the Royal College of Surgeons of 1.8. So as long as they're 1.8 and we're 2.3, we're all good, I think. Isn't that how it works? So in terms of surgery journals, we had a ranking of about 105th out of 212 in the ranking we had. So we're about sort of 50th centile, if you will, among surgical journals, which in fairness is pretty good, all considered. So how important are impact factors and how is it calculated? Just to remind people, it is a mathematical calculation, and like all these things, they can be gamed, and that's the truth of it. So impact factors are calculated based on the number of citations your published journals get. So in 2021, they work out how many times papers you published in 2019 and 2020 are cited. And the number of citations is divided by the total number of publications you did in the preceding 2 years. And that's how an impact factor is calculated. So roughly an impact factor of 1 means that a paper you published in 2019, someone else cited it once in 2021. So it is something that is, it has its limits, it has its benefits. But in terms of the world, we explain the world in terms of things that we can measure. And this is the best way people have come up with to date of trying to rank journals and come up with a profile. But it does explain some things. So, for example, the dying art of the case report, is factored into this. Journals are very interested in randomized trials, clearly, and review papers, and sort of less interesting things that are less likely to be cited are probably not prioritized as much. So for your journal, The Surgeon, this is a joint product between the College of Surgeons in Edinburgh and the College of Surgeons in Dublin. It's founded in 2003. It's had 4 editors-in-chief so far. So I'm the current one, but I was a section editor before that. I became a deputy editor 2 years ago and then took over as editor this January. And the cycle is going to be more formalised, one of the jobs I have to do, but it does flick between the College of Surgeons in Dublin and Edinburgh, and it has a an important relationship between the two organisations. So obviously we publish lots of articles. Going back to the early forms of the journal, there's book reviews, there's case reports, there's kind of opinion pieces. It's nearly like a parish pump newspaper if you go back to the original entities. But that's not really what this journal is about now. There are lots of other ways that we give you information about college activities, and we don't do it through this journal. Clearly, this is a scholarship enterprise, and that's the point of it. We have 6 issues a year at 64 pages per issue, and that's the budget limitation that we have. And we have last year added on an online element to it, and I'll come back to that. So this is the kind of interesting stuff that I think anyway that you might find interesting. These are the number of journals that we get in over the last sort of 5 years. And as Melina found in 2020, there was quite a kick up there at 742 articles submitted to us for consideration then. By November 21, it was 497. That topped out at 524. So it's gone up a bit from about 300 to probably 500, I suspect, is where it'll settle. And you can see the kind of reject rates, which I'll give a bit more details on, and acceptance and withdrawn. But that's the kind of number that we get asked to review for a journal that does 6 issues a year. In terms of where they come from, given the nature of our journal, clearly there is a large local interest, but we do get submissions from all around the world. We don't get too many from Africa. We get quite a number from Asia, dominated by China. They can be articles which are superb to articles which are quite strange, and we have to look at those sometimes. There's a lot from Europe, obviously, and that sort of pattern is the dominant pattern. In terms of the top countries that get accepted, the United Kingdom seems to be the highest portion of articles that are accepted, Ireland number 2. And I guess that reflects the number of articles that we get in many ways from those sort of parts of the world. Italy comes in number 3, China number 4, the United States 5. We get data in terms of the citations of the articles that are produced, and these would be the top 10 citations. The articles with the highest citations in recent years from the journal. My favourite one is the one on sleep deprivation there by Paul Ridgway. That actually was running number 1 for a good while, but other ones caught up. For the submitter, you've just had a fabulous summary from our previous speaker in terms of how to go about your manuscript and how to put it in. And I couldn't agree more with the comments about the introduction. Like, an introduction is a small thing. We don't need massive stuff on that. And I always find that an article that does that that sets the tone. They don't really have a clear purpose of what they're at. So in terms of the topics and stuff that comes our way, we've had very strange articles submitted to us that really, as you've alluded to, they haven't looked at what our journal is. They haven't looked at our table of contents. They're just firing off articles and getting rejected, turning it over and firing it again. And that kind of really does stand out in the stuff that comes into you. But what we run in our journal is about a 61% desk rejection. So that's the article comes in, and at a publisher editor stage, it's obvious from the start that this article isn't going to mature and to a level that's going to be produced in our journal. If you get to revision status, you really are in a very good position. And while authors can get a bit sensitive about some of the feedback that comes through, as Melina's alluded to, you need to understand that you're nearly there if you just handle that right. If you just manage that bit of feedback correctly, you will get over the line. So about 20% odd of journals will get over the line, but 60% of articles get over the line, but about 60% fall at the desk submission level. We try and turn that around quick, to be fair to people, and then about half of the ones that go out to review will get through. So the real purpose of this side is to the right-hand side. If you can see, these are the rejection rate or acceptance rate of different types of articles that come to the journal. So we don't take too much correspondence, as about 15%, 14% rejection of our acceptance of correspondence. We haven't taken uninvited editorials because they're uninvited and people just kind of submit them in randomly, expecting us to submit them when they don't fit in what we're doing. So we tended to reject those. A full-length article submitted to the surgeon has about a 16% acceptance rate at the end of the day, which is what the reader or the submitter really wants to know. Review articles have a better chance of getting over the line, if you note there. About 41% of those will get over the line. I guess that reflects the education role of the journal, and it does have that kind of, for the college, that kind of education role. So review articles and more didactic articles are certainly very, very welcomed. In terms of time to acceptance, our desk reject rate is 2.6 weeks. On average, we do need to improve that a bit. In terms of articles that get out to review, it seems to take us about 8 weeks from the time the submitter to the time that we've reached a conclusion. We'll do our best to work on that. I'll come back to that in a bit. So what are the difficult bits, which was the title of this one, was what are the difficulties of a low-impact journal? So these are my two difficulties. The human factor stuff is we're all used to, but the two major difficulties is space and reviews. So what do we mean by that? Well, space. So everyone is sending in really good stuff into us, but I only have 6 issues at 64 pages, and that's a budget. So I have 348 pages to print a year, full stop, and I can't go above that. So unless we change that, but this is where we are at the moment. So we have to be selective about what comes in. Last year, we introduced an e-print form, so we got 500 pages available to us online, and we have that again this year. It's a much cheaper publishing format because it doesn't have to be distributed to every member of the College of Surgeons of Ireland and every member of the College of Surgeons of Edinburgh who get a hard copy of our current issue. So that has allowed us publish a slightly higher number of papers. So in terms of reviewers, this is our other challenge. And maybe this is where the low impact factor journal comes into it a bit. All this is digitized. So going back to May 2010, I can see all the activity that's gone on. So in Ireland, there's been 201 individual reviewers have helped us in the last 12 years. In the UK, 571. Around the world, outside of that, 432. Our best performer in Ireland has done 68 reviews for us. I've spoken to him. He loves it. He gives great reviews. I feel bad sending him more sometimes, but he seems to enjoy it. So, but I don't want one person, if you will, having a huge dominant impact. There's a character in the UK who I don't know so well who's done 101. But on average, it's about 3 articles over 12 years per reviewer, which isn't a ginormous amount. But in terms of the acceptance rate, in the Irish surgeons alone, out of 1,446 invites, only 544 were accepted. And out of that, only 431 get completed. So we have a reviewer challenge where we invite people and about 1 in 3 will accept and only 80% of those will convert. So we get roughly a 30% completion from our invites. That's among Irish reviewers. Among the UK, it's essentially the same. Very similar patterns. So our challenge really is competing for the time and attention of some of our reviewers. So how to become a reviewer, which would be my take-home message today if anyone's really interested. You can email me direct, cardiothoracic@gmail.com, cardiothoracic@gmail.com. It's up there. You can, if anyone wants to write it down, I'll happily help you get loaded up in the system if you're not already there. You can do it through the journal website, direct yourself. You can Google the Surgeon Journal if you can't remember any of the addresses or my email, or you can look at the hard copy that comes to you every 2 months. So I absolutely welcome reviewers. Anyone who wants to, please come with me. I'm very sorry if you feel you'd like to be a reviewer and you haven't been asked. I'm very sorry about that because I really would love more reviewers. So if anyone feels they're not being included or not being invited or whatever, please come to me. I want you to review. I would emphasize we've had a great talk there on what an author should do. There are also talks to be done on what a reviewer should do. And I think one of the key things to simplify it for people, for me, is a reviewer is supposed to help the author get it to a point that it can be published, not to criticize it, not to tear it down, not to say I'm smarter than you, which is kind of a really irritating review for me as an editor to get, never mind the reviewer, or never mind the author. What the reviewer really is supposed to do is help the author get it to a point that it's publishable. And that's really what I want a reviewer to do. So if anyone wants to be a reviewer, please contact me. We'll get you set up. And there's no problem. There's lots of articles to review. So for the development point of view, for me, what I want to do is I want to try and reward the reviewers. I don't have a budget to pay people. No one really does for this kind of thing. It's a scholarship, altruistic, noble interest in your specialty kind of purpose. So what can I do to reward you? I can give you CPD points for doing a review. You get 1 for every review. Lots of people tell me they have lots of CPD points. But it's what we can do. I can also, I'm going to publish a list of everyone who reviews for us every year. We'll go in printed form as well. We've introduced special issues. So this year we had a global surgery special issue. We'll try and do a special themed issue once a year because one of the feedbacks we've got is sometimes the journal is quite broad and there's a lot of different topics in it. And can we pull it together? We'll work on our time to decision if we can, and if I can get some help from reviewers, we'll certainly improve that. We're going to tighten up our author instructions, which are a bit loose at the moment. We're going to try and codify the editorial team. At the moment, there aren't sort of defined terms, or how long an editor is in place, or how long that people take a position on the editorial board, and I'm going to tighten that up again. And in the back of it all, I have to maintain a link with all college activities, because these are college journals, and they do serve a purpose for academic scholarship, but also a purpose for the two colleges. We did our special edition this year on global surgery. I think it was really an excellent idea. It's the first time we've done it with Carroll as the specialty editor for this. And it really, to my mind, came together as a really nice package, if anyone has read it, and I hope you've enjoyed it. For the journal teams, as Melina's alluded to, a journal can't be everything, and a surgeon has a real challenge because it has a very broad sort of church of things to do. So we have to focus on certain things. So given the roles of the college, the kind of things that we focus on are the education of a surgeon, I think working life and operational issues for a surgeon, and Surgery 21, as in 2100, the future of surgery. Single issue, single centre surgeons series saying how wonderful a surgeon you are really isn't going to cut it. Question for you to finish is, at the moment you get a hard copy circulated to you in the post of the journal. Nearly every other journal that you work with is an email with a content update, and you get an online access to it. So there are real issues or questions about how to do it. Some people give me different feedback on that, but I'd welcome any feedback people have, because this is a decision for the surgeon to make. Do we continue with the hard copy form where it comes to your post every day, or do we switch to an online form? Advantages and disadvantages to all that. We don't do much advertising at the moment, and maybe we should look at that, but it comes to you as part of your membership and fellowship of the college. If you wanted to join the editorial team, always welcome to people who are interested. I guess it starts by being a reviewer for the journal and being an active reviewer, and hopefully getting a sense of how it all works, and really, making it clear that you're going to give it the time that it does take, and it does take a bit of time. But I'm happy to talk to anyone who's interested. I do have to be mindful of the two college entity. As Melina said, she has a board proportion to think of, and we have a bit of that as well to remember. It's not just an RCSI event. So in conclusion, I'd say the title was The Difficulties of Low Impact Journal, but to be honest, I have no problem getting good articles. We get loads of good articles. We get more good articles than I'll ever be able to publish, and that's the problem. So we have to manage our space, and that means we're picking and choosing. And if you're not getting through and it's not accepted, it's not that we're being bad, it's just that sometimes there's a rank of priority, and sometimes, unfortunately, you're the 10th article on COVID that came through that month, and if it was first, it might have got there, but that's just the way it goes. We do compete for reviewer time and attention, and that really is an operational issue that's our main struggle, if we're honest. And in the background, we have to remember our place in the mission of the colleges. So thank you very much.
David, that's fantastic, and I think it's so reassuring for us in the college to know that the surgeon is in very good hands, and that actually copy is not the issue, and good articles is not the issue. It's the challenges, space, and the reviewers. And I think you better head to the airport, and all you need to do is to bring back the Triple Crown. So well done, and thank you. And it's a great pleasure to introduce Derek Alderson. We have soldiered, as I said, in the trenches, deep in the trenches of the BJS for longer than I care to remember. We're great friends, and he has undertaken the initiative of the BJS Open. And so, Derek, you're very welcome.
Thank you very much, Roland. It's great to be here. It's good to manage to get out and see real people in a real audience. It's fantastic. So I'm going to talk just for 2 minutes to give you a bit of context and background to the development of open access publication, and then maybe 10 minutes, not more, on the kind of current state of play and where I think this is taking us. So surgical journal, or rather a journal production, it sort of goes back to about the 17th century, the very first things. But the journal as we know it is really a 19th century phenomenon. You can see here that the big journals like New England Journal, The Lancet, the BMJ, all began in the 19th century. The first broad surgical journal is actually the Annals of Surgery, the American Journal, 1885. The specialist journal, or the surgical journal, really is a 20th century phenomenon. That's really when they all started. One of the first, of course, was BJS. And you can see here's the original editorial committee that Lord Moynihan founded in 1913. Those of you with sharp eyes will see that it was the British Empire that formed this basic group. The journal was aimed at the surgeons of the British Empire. And there are some notable surgeons from Ireland, of course, in that list. Sir Charles Ball, Baronet, surgeon to King George at the time, and Sir, what's his name? Thomas Miles, that's who I was thinking. Thanks, Ronan. It's a good job I've got him here, really. Sir Thomas Miles, previous president of this college, and a person who was instrumental, of course, in the development of Irish Home Rule that led to independence. So this is the kind of forerunner of the modern journal. This is how you ended up with something that became peer review and an editorial committee. So all of these journals that I've spoken about so far are what we call subscription journals. And these are the characteristics of the subscription journal. It belongs to a society, an association, a college, for instance, a charity, and in some cases, Annals of Surgery, a publisher. It involves a financial arrangement between that title owner and the publisher, and this is usually to do with how many pages do we think we can fill, and how many issues are we going to produce a year, and therefore how much are you going to charge for this? And that income is generated using various types of subscription model. Most journals now exist in two formats, print and or digital versions, and nearly all surgical journals involve some type of peer review editorial process, as Melina explained to you in detail. Remember the point at the bottom that she made to you before. You will be giving your copyright to the publisher, which means that you must be very careful about plagiarism. You can plagiarize your own written work. So you can't simply repeat, cut and paste text from one page, from one article to another. And a modern journal sort of looks like this. You've seen it. It may have acquired other journals as the years have gone by. It may involve a number of specialist surgical associations and societies. It will contain a series of scientific articles in various formats. It will almost certainly be printed in color, and you hopefully will be with a pretty smart publisher. And everything was roses in the garden, and it was just rolling along nicely until this guy came along with his damned iPad and his smartphone and tablets and said, you know, you can do a lot better than the stuff that you get just on paper. I can even have images that can move, you know, called video. How about that? And of course, everything that relates to digital publication stems from that time. Of course, this makes people think about stuff. So it's better than paper. We have the ability to do more than we can simply with paper. And of course, in the last 5 years, we've had other considerations about paper, those that are environmental. How much longer can we keep on, as it were, knocking trees down when we can produce perfectly good journals electronically? The costs of postage, the limitation of size that you have with subscription journals generated on paper. All of this, of course, has made people think really hard about digital publication, and it wasn't very long before people said, even the model of the way in which we pay for journals, surely it can change, because if you don't have to produce it in print, you don't have to ship it, it must be cheaper. So why am I paying this college, this association, this society, this small fortune, when it should be substantially cheaper? Well, as you can see, this really wasn't an original idea of the 21st century. And a man called Frederick Hammett actually wrote back in 1937 that the subscription journal model probably wasn't a great idea. And he stated quite specifically that he thought that the cost of publication should be where it belongs, on the institutions sponsoring the work. So what is open access publication? Well, it's, in short, the first paragraph here is the sort of official definition, but it's the notion of being able to read an article free on a sort of global basis. And it can be described widely. Most people use the term author pays. But by author pays, you may, of course, mean that your grant awarding body, your sponsor, pays, or the institution that you work for is willing to pay. And these are called the article processing charges, or APCs. And this is what open access publication is and how it's different from subscription publication. It's complicated, sadly, because across the globe people have interpreted open access in different ways. And there are lots of other open access types, as well as the common ones that I've shown you here. Including black open access, which means that you've used some illegal bit of machinery and website through which you've managed to access journals and identify the content, even though they're perhaps they're not open access. So gold means it's widely made available. Green I'll come on to in just a second or two. Hybrid is certainly around. That's a subscription journal that agrees to publish a certain number or a certain volume of work on an open access basis and make it freely available. And there are a very small number of journals, not in surgery, that make no APCs whatsoever and simply have a wealthy sponsor who is willing to make publication free of charge. The green method, though, is perhaps the one that is most worthy of our attention as surgeons, because it doesn't really exist to any great degree in the world of surgical publication, but is beginning to become more prevalent in the whole biomedical publication sphere. And that is the notion of greater transparency and a willingness for all of us to make our source data available for other readers and for reviewers. And of course, this is quite important if people are at a later date trying to amalgamate data in systematic reviews and meta-analyses. This is the process by which you would place your work on a preprint server, of which there are many. Archive, MedArchive, BioArchive, and this is a pre-peer review repository. It has a DOI, digital object identifier, so that your work cannot be, you can identify the origin of your work because it will be dated, and people can look at it there and modify it. And this is probably quite important for people who are producing work that might be part of their thesis, for instance, where they may have an examination that is prior to being able to get something all the way through a conventional peer-reviewed journal. So there are advantages and likely changes that come with open access publication in the style in which we submit work and the way in which work is peer-reviewed and published. So you still end up at the end of the day submitting something to a journal, and there is a version of record, which I've shown at the bottom of this slide, which would be the one that would appear in your CV and your list of publications. Roland asked me just to say a word or two, though, about the BJS Open. In 2015, we had the notion that we were rejecting an enormous amount of work in BJS, and that this work was certainly worthy of publication, but we didn't have space for it in a paper journal. And so we worked on the idea that perhaps open access publication would be the future, and we weren't sure at the time, and that we would have a source of material that we could produce in an open access journal, and we began in 2017 with BJS Open. As I say, we were fortunate in that we knew that there was a reservoir of material that we couldn't publish in BJS, and so we made offers to people, it's called waterfalling or cascading, to see if they would be interested in publishing in BJS Open, this brand new journal. Of course, persuading people to publish in a brand new journal isn't a very easy thing to do, because you don't have in medical indexing. That takes about 2 years, and you don't have an impact factor. So why the hell should I publish in a journal that is not rated? So it's not an easy thing to start with. But of course, you can do all of the things that I've mentioned so far, and at the end of it all, if you are lucky, 2 years after indexing, you'll be able to see whether or not you have an impact factor, and we had an impact factor of nearly 3.5. So, are we moving towards an era of open access surgery, open access publication in surgery? And I think the answer is undoubtedly yes, we are. As you heard from Melina, the number of articles that are being published in surgery is rising year on year. It doesn't show any great sign of stopping. The United States remains at the top of the tree, but if I'd shown you this chart of where the different nations are that are publishing nowadays, and I'd gone back 10 or 20 years to when Ronan and I were coal-face workers, China would have been probably not even in the top 20, but now it's second, with an enormous amount of work submitted from China, but actually relatively low acceptance rates. And the United Kingdom is third, and Ireland punches above its weight in 33rd position. I thought you'd probably want to know where you were. But this is probably the most important thing. If you look at major funders of research and surgical research, these are the main organizations on a global basis, and an increasing number of these organizations in the States, NIH, in the UK, the MRC, NIHR, now stipulate that work that they sponsor and are willing to underwrite must be published open access. And if you publish it in a subscription journal, that subscription journal must be willing to make the article available as an open access article. And in the UK, we're now seeing that next tier, Cancer Research UK, for instance, British Heart Foundation, the Wellcome Trust, all beginning to move in this direction and insist on open access publication. If you're not convinced, this year, or last year rather, was the first year in which open access publication exceeded subscription publication. So I think that the writing's on the wall, and you have to get used to the idea that this new model will come in. And the major publishers have worked on systems together. It's called Read and Publish, that enables libraries to purchase subscription, but from a bundling process that will facilitate this. It's not all roses in the garden, though, and I'll just finish with a couple of slides to get this in perspective. This was actually written by the editor-in-chief of Jama, not long before Jama surgery existed. I love this. I mean, this is a fantastic bit of invective to tell you that there's an awful lot of tripe that gets published. And that, there is nothing that people will not try and get published, and there still is probably too much that actually gets published. And of course, that's one of the downsides, perhaps, of open access publication. If you're willing to pay for it, if you're willing to put your hand in your pocket, you will find somebody who is willing to publish it and put it out there. So it does rather, unfortunately, put the emphasis on quantity over quality. Now, some people will dispute the philosophy that's inherent in this and say that's not too terrible a thing. If it's really poor quality, nobody reads it, nobody cites it, so people are daft enough to pay, let them pay. But there are other things. The notion, the Matthew effect, the rich get richer. As you can see, if big funders are willing to underwrite the cost of having an article published by a highly prestigious, successful academic group of surgeons, then they will get more grants and they will get more money to enable them to publish. Whereas the people who are further down the food chain trying to get a start made may find it very difficult to acquire the funding that would allow them to get their work published. And already there are some institutions in Europe that will not release the funds if you intend to publish in a journal with a low impact factor. They say that the money that they have available for open access publication is limited, and they wish to limit it to journals with an impact factor above, and they will have a certain number. Of course, this means that in some disciplines, and not medicine, but the poor professor of history has virtually no chance of getting his or her work out in publication. We also have, of course, this thing called predatory publishers. I don't know how many emails you get a day asking me to submit my latest masterpiece to the Journal of Surgical Bullshit. But, you know, you've seen this kind of thing. And, of course, you can put your hand in your pocket and give somebody some money for something that just isn't even indexed, never mind doesn't have an impact factor. And sadly, there are hidden paywalls and embargoes that make things a little more complex than they should be, but these are probably soluble problems. So, where are we in the world of surgical publishing, and where are we likely to go? I think it will all be digital. I think the day of the paper journal is disappearing. It's not like books, which have been around for centuries and have other appeals. I think that the day of the published printed journal, the days are numbered. I think that subscription models will be progressively displaced by open access publication. I think that we will, as a community of surgeons, move along with the rest of our medical colleagues towards a wider use of data repositories and the use of preprints. And I think that would be good for surgery. It increases transparency, and it has no real downsides. Peer review, of course, can be changed to reflect these modern things. You can have your work looked at by somebody if you use this type of approach and obtain comment before you submit it to a journal. And undoubtedly, we need to move beyond simply using the impact factor and other measures of quality in order to be sure that surgical publication remains as good as it can be. Thank you very much.
Well, Derek, thank you as ever. I think actually I'm going to use editorial prerogative, and I'm going to put a big red line through the discussion, because it's just after 12:45 and lunch is awaiting, and we have to be back for the Johnson & Johnson lecture at 1:30. But can I thank our speakers? All of us have been authors, many of us reviewers, and all of us have been rejected at some stage by an editor. So thank you for that, and I think we've had a good session that I'd now like to bring to a close. Thank you.